Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
There is a light we can't always see. If there is a world we can't always be. If there is a dark, then we shut it down. There is a light, don't let it go out.
There is a crack in everything.
There is a light we can't always see. If there is a world we can't always be. If there is a dark, then we shut it down. There is a light, don't let it go out.
There is a crack in everything.
Good morning and welcome to you all. We invite you into our spiritual community of hope, courage, and compassion. I light this candle to begin our service. Now, if you will, take a deep breath and release it as we ready our hearts and minds to enter this precious space together. Be the light. In a dark world, be the one who speaks truth lovingly. Be the voice that shows mercy. Be the song of hope. It is my honor to introduce to you this morning our speaker, Dr. Todd Eklof. Todd is a native of San Francisco and has been minister of the UU Church of Spokane since 2011. There he is appreciated for his mind-altering sermons, compassionate soul, and social activism. Todd started in ministry as an ordained Southern Baptist minister, but left the Christian faith while still in seminary as a young man, explaining, "I simply outgrew it." He then began a 16-year career in television, news, and corporate video production. During that time, he became a Unitarian Universalist, and in 1999, he re-entered the ministry as a UU minister, serving the Clifton UU Church in Louisville, Kentucky, until 2011. He has been widely appreciated for his environmental and gay rights activism, in addition to engaging in areas of criminal justice reform, restorative justice, the peace movement, as well as immigration and racial justice. Todd has 2 undergraduate degrees, one in philosophy and one in communication, a master's degree in religious studies, and a doctorate of ministry. He is also a certified member of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. Reverend Eklof and others founded the North American Unitarian Association in February of 22. It is a member service organization dedicated to supporting and promoting the practice of liberal religion by embracing freedom, reason, and tolerance, rooted in a commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and all peoples. Our fellowship joined the organization this last year. Be sure to check out what they have to offer on their website. Todd and his spouse of 33 years have a 31-year-old son and a 27-year-old daughter. I first became aware of Todd when I read encounters in the media of the stir he created when he wrote and distributed his now famous book, The Gadfly Papers, at the UUA General Assembly in 2019. His writing helped to crystallize for me the concerns and objections that had been brewing regarding the illiberal trends at Wildflower Church. I wrote to thank Todd for his courage and his clarity. That he has since been a source of inspiration and illumination for me and others in our nascent fellowship and beyond. I am grateful for his work and his presence with her today, and I'm pleased to introduce to you the Gadfly himself and my friend, Dr. Todd Eklof.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction and your personal sentiments as well. I share them. You and Mary were among the very first to reach out to me in the early days following the Gadfly Papers to offer your support. And I have to say, for the first few, the UUA worked to immediately isolate me, even from my own congregation. And so I didn't know where I stood with anybody in the world. If I was, well, my wife and I, Peggy, both, Peggy, who's sitting in the background here, making sure the dogs don't go crazy when another dog walks by the windows. But we literally just felt like we'd been cut off from existence and didn't know how it was going to pan out. And it wasn't until people started reaching out and saying, hey, we're with you on this, you're not alone, that we started to realize we were going to be okay. And you were among the first to do that. So I thank you, and I am really appreciate and honored to be back with your fellowship this morning. My talk today, what the world needs now. I want to begin actually by going way back to the beginning of Western philosophy and a view about it that is entirely my own. And so, a disclaimer, I know of no other philosophers or thinkers who have said anything similar, and I can't think of any who would agree with me. To the contrary, I imagine that most philosophers would strongly disagree, which probably means I'm wrong. Nonetheless, my thesis is this, that much of what has long been considered and taught as philosophy emerged in reaction against philosophy and should be considered its antithesis. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this provocative claim today, yet to understand the history of liberalism, of which we are a part, and historical resistances to it, it's helpful to know how frequently and continuously it has been countered by the emergence of illiberal schools of thought that have overshadowed and stalled its promise and its progress. Nevertheless, these illiberal and antithetical schools of thought came to be included among the many ideas that we now count as philosophy. The very first of these anti-philosophers, in my opinion, was none other than Socrates, who for many is counted as the greatest of philosophers. And I can hear the entire philosophical world shrieking at the very suggestion that he, of all people, should not be considered a philosopher. Yet the demarcation between Socrates and what philosophy was considered before him is made clear in the teachings of philosophy itself. Every philosopher before Socrates, the originators of philosophy, the first philosophers, are called pre-Socratic because of how significantly Socrates diverged from them. The early philosophers, beginning with Thales of Miletus, born in Asia Minor, roughly 2,600 years ago, were the first thinkers we know of who attempted to explain how the world works in natural rather than supernatural terms, using math, astronomy, and experimentation. Thales and other pre-Socratic philosophers came up with elemental, atomic, evolutionary, and heliocentric theories about nature and the universe, and discovered things like musical octaves, irrational numbers, meteorology, certain medical breakthroughs, surgery, and scientific experimentation. And this is why Aristotle, a student of Plato, fondly referred to these earliest philosophers as physikoi, the physicist. So extraordinary and unprecedented were they that modern philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The rise of Greek civilization, which produced this outburst of intellectual activity, is one of the most spectacular events in history. Nothing like it has ever occurred before or since." Most importantly, for our purposes here, is to understand that for these early philosophers to have discovered so much, they had to believe they could. They had to believe, that is, in their own human agency and ability to figure things out. They had to believe they did not need gods, nor authorities, nor dictums to understand the world, but that they could figure it out for themselves. And it is this positive attitude toward human agency and human reason that is the seed from which liberalism sprouts, rooted in its first principle, universal human dignity. Now, this is not to suggest that Socrates was anti-human. He was clearly a very wise and thoughtful figure whose ideas deserve to be considered and put into practice. He is to be contrasted from the early philosophers, however, because he turned away from their focus on physics and matter. Socrates turned his interest inward. "Know thyself," he said, "and the unconsidered life is not worth living." While still a young man, he turned his attention away from physics to ethics because of the former's fruitless quest to know reality, which he called a waste of energy, when the far more important question is how one should live goes unanswered. So Socrates didn't want to understand the natural world, but wanted to achieve moral excellence and to know what it takes to live the good life. In this sense, he might better be considered an early therapist or a self-help guru than a philosopher. Plato, who introduces us to the historical Socrates in his early writings and later uses him as a rhetorical device to espouse his own ideas, diverged so far from the pre-Socratic philosophers that he discounted the value of the natural realm altogether, claiming that a non-physical realm of perfect forms ought to be considered the true reality. And despite this idealism, which has nothing to do with the thinking of the first philosophers, Plato's name remains a household name, though most of us would be hard-pressed to name a single pre-Socratic philosopher. After Plato came the great Aristotle, still in the 4th century BCE, who righted the ship again briefly by emphasizing physics and reason. In the history of philosophy, philosopher A.C. Grayling begins his chapter on Aristotle by saying, if Aristotle were alive today, he would be a scientist, and most likely a biologist. He would have a lively interest in scientific method and logic. Like the first philosophers, Aristotle, the creator of formal logic, with the principles of which have lasted to this day, highly valued our ability to reason, so much so that he considered it our defining quality. Thus, the secret of happiness, he thought, is to live up to that thing which is distinctive and defining of humanity, namely the possession of reason. But after Aristotle, the Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans emerged and, inspired by Socrates, re-emphasized the central importance of developing guidelines for living a good and ethical and maybe happy life. Until then, philosopher William Irvine says philosophers were primarily interested in explaining the world around them and the phenomenon of the world in doing what we now call science. But as the Roman Stoic Epictetus said, what do I care whether all existing things are composed of atoms, or of indivisibilities, or of fire or earth? Is it not enough to learn the true nature of the good and the evil? This again is not to say that cynicism, stoicism, Epicureanism, and the wisdom of Socrates aren't valuable means of coping with life, but their goal of living a good and happy life is entirely different than the pre-Socratic goal of understanding the natural world and how it works. Yet, as philosopher W.J. Oates writes, at least in its earliest stages, the orientation of philosophy was to the external world. In this respect, especially knowing that Socrates, the Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans largely avoided the abstractions of the first philosophers, it is fair to say that their thinking was antithetical, and it is difficult to understand how two things so different can be called by the same name, philosophy. I won't go much more into the history of philosophy here, but want to use what I've already said to illustrate what I consider a back and forth between philosophy's original emphasis and various ideological reactions against it, all of which oddly are called philosophy. Just prior to the Christian era, the skeptics and sophists also emerged, who respectively denied that human beings can obtain knowledge, not even through reason, and that we can therefore use fallacious reasoning to argue anything we wish is true. Indeed, some of the greatest names in philosophy yet to come, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Schleiermacher, Nietzsche, and Sartre, rejected reason to varying degrees, which led to the 20th century postmodernism that underlies the mindset many today refer to as woke or wokeism. When Christianity became dominant in the 4th century CE, almost all philosophy was considered heresy and paganism. An estimated 90% of the works of antiquity were destroyed because of this hostility. Neoplatonism, one that survived, became the dominant mindset, which lent itself well to a religion obsessed with having the right ideas and perfection in non-material heaven, rather than with hard facts and physical reality. The Roman Catholic Church dominated Western society for nearly a millennium until the Reformation weakened its stronghold. Once some were brave enough and free enough to question its doctrines and challenge its authority, starting in the 1300s, the Renaissance began. Renaissance, which means renewal, was named so for the rediscovery and renewed interest in the pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly their rational and empirical approach to understanding. And with this came a renewed and growing appreciation for humanity, human agency, human reason, human dignity, and a recognition that individuals should be free to determine and express their own beliefs, and that societies must be tolerant of ideological differences. This is the attitude that spread and flourished during the Enlightenment period in the 16th and 1700s. The Enlightenment philosophy, rooted in the proto-scientific thinking of the pre-Socratic philosophers 2,600 years ago, can be summarized as a belief in human dignity that results in freedom, reason, and tolerance. Now, what do we mean by those words? Freedom means that every person must be free to think and speak for themselves and to choose their own purposes and meaning in life without prejudice. Reason means that every person has the capacity to think and consider the empirical evidence. Let me repeat that. Reason means that every person has the capacity to think and consider the empirical evidence before them in their pursuit of truth and understanding. So it's not really about the expectation that people should be reasonable or logical, but that they can be. And therefore, we ought to respect their right to think for themselves. Ideological dictums and religious dogmas should not be imposed upon them. That's what Enlightenment reason is about. Not merely thinking logically, but allowing people to think for themselves. And therefore, tolerance means that every person, regardless of their specific ideologies and identities, should have equal standing and equal access to the benefits and protections of society. It means living peacefully together, even when we disagree. Wouldn't that be nice? When these are a society's overarching principles, it progresses. When not, it doesn't. We've already seen all that was accomplished by the pre-Socratic philosophers once they were able to explore the physical world on its own terms, free from superstition and dogma. Yet after the pre-Socratic era, when philosophical navel-gazing began, followed by the advent of the Holy Roman Empire and its dogmatism, little to no progress was made for more than 1,000 years. Think about that. Think about how fast we progressed in just these past few decades in so many ways, regressed in many others. But think about it. Think about how we could have been living on Mars by now, were it not for this dark age. 1,000 years, a millennium of darkness, because everybody had to have the same idea. It wasn't until the Renaissance, precipitated by the invention of the printing press early in the 15th century, that dogma lost its hold. Communication became rampant, and society necessarily became more curious and tolerant as a result. During the Renaissance, with this renewed interest in the pro-human thinking of the early philosophers, luminaries began calling for tolerance of different voices and insisting, instead of everyone holding just one accepted idea, that we gain wisdom from the teachings of humanity the world over, the studio humanitatis, the study of humanity, not just Christianity, but everything. And that's when the Edict of Torda, the first religious freedom law, was passed by Transylvanian Unitarians in 1568. This mindset flourished during the Enlightenment between the 17th and 18th centuries, leading to a century of unprecedented advances in the 19th. As the Unitarian minister John Dietrich, the father of religious humanism, put it, it was this movement of liberalism which marks the 19th century as the most remarkable period of human history. In fact, the 19th century did more to add to the sum total of human life than all the other centuries of the Christian era put together. Now, for those of us who weren't around during the 1800s, the Canadian scientist and distinguished professor emeritus of Montego University, Eklof Smil, explains it well in his 2020 book, Numbers Don't Lie. Some might think the 21st century has had the most profound inventions in history, but not so according to Smil, because most recent advances have been variations of two older fundamental discoveries, microprocessors and exploiting radio waves. That happened in the 1800s, which occurred again during the century following what was really the conclusion of the formal Enlightenment period. In fact, Smil says perhaps the most inventive time in human history was the 1880s. That's when electricity became a household commodity, thanks to the invention of thermal and hydropower generation stations that still provide 80% of the world's electricity. It's also when the first electromagnetic waves were discovered, leading to the first wireless communications technology. Anybody remember what that is? The radio. The first wireless technology that was able to connect us all, tune us all into the same program at a great distance. How far we've come since then. Electric irons, multi-story skyscrapers, the steam turbine, coin-operated vending machines, the four-stroke combustion engine, elevators, revolving doors, electric streetcars, electric motors, cash registers, X-rays, ultraviolet light, infrared radiation, microwaves, chain-driven bicycles, and other inventions that our lives and technology still depend upon today were all discovered during the 19th century, immediately following the Enlightenment's age of reason. And the Enlightenment also led to significant social revolutions. It was the Enlightenment principles, freedom, reason, and tolerance rooted in human dignity, that led the framers of the U.S. Constitution to fashion our fragile democracy and to call for other novel reforms like the rule of law, the abolition of slavery, women's equality and suffrage, gay rights, prison reform, an end to warfare, child labor laws, animal welfare laws, and public education. The desire for human dignity also led to another important 19th century event that was necessary to correct a problem that was compromised, that I should say that the compromised U.S. constitutions and Declaration of Independence could not: the Civil War. Right? They tried to compromise by recognizing partial humanity of blacks, but not the full humanity, in order to get the Declaration and the Constitution signed, get people on board. But they were just putting off the inevitable, and that resulted in the Civil War. According to political scientist Francis Fukuyama, this occurred in part because of the Enlightenment's notion that all human beings are equal in dignity and worth, despite their evident natural and social differences. And because of this, slaves themselves were becoming empowered through increasing consciousness of their own worth. That's Enlightenment thinking. That's liberal thinking. German philosopher Heinrich Treitschke once said, "Everything new that the 19th century created is the work of liberalism." And Fukuyama says the same is true in general. Historically, liberal societies have been engines of economic growth, creators of new technologies, and producers of vibrant art and culture. This occurred precisely, he says, because they were liberal. But this hasn't happened by magic, but because the tenets of liberalism allow individuals the freedom to explore new ideas and to use their own innovative minds to interpret empirical facts in order to discover and create, and to do so in a society that tolerates differences and new ways of understanding and being in the world. This is why these are the only principles by which a society can make genuine social, economic, and technological advances. Yet each time we get close to establishing a healthy and genuinely liberal society, its antithesis emerges to thwart us. And of course, calls itself legitimate. Maybe even calls itself by the old name: philosophers. It was, oddly enough, Socrates' introspection and Plato's idealism that subjugated the first philosophers to being merely pre-Socratic, an incidental footnote in the history of philosophy before it really began. Aristotle briefly got us back on track with his emphasis on logic and science, but his ideas were also subsumed by the cynical, Stoic, and Epicurean self-help gurus, along with those who were skeptical that any truth could be known, and those who exploited such uncertainty to make anything they wanted sound true. Whenever materialist and empiricist philosophies emerged, holding that matter, physics, is the fundamental nature of reality and that truth is derived from sensory experience, they were met by rationalists and skeptics who argued truth is derived by thought, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and that it is not possible to know objective truth. A.C. Grayling says one of the earliest opponents of the Enlightenment itself was Romanticism. The Romantics, he said, asserted instead the primacy of emotion over reason, and accordingly celebrated the subjective, the personal, the visionary, and the irrational. They gave a privileged place to moods and passions as sources of insight and arbiters of truth. Sounding familiar? Today, I should say toward the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th centuries, philosophers like pragmatist John Dewey, logician and mathematician Bertrand Russell, and humanist John Dietrich restored philosophy to its pre-Socratic roots, only to have these sensibilities challenged almost immediately again with the emergence of postmodernism, the rejection of science and empiricism, and the notion there is no such things as objective truth or a common human nature. All truth is subjective, and any belief is just as good as another. And today's wokeism is but the latest incarnation of idealism, romanticism, rationalism, postmodernism, and so forth, a rejection of reason and empirical experience in favor of anyone's subjective beliefs and felt or lived experiences. In the 21st century, liberalism is additionally despised by conservatism, which seeks to slow or altogether halt progress, and neoliberalism, the belief that government should have no power to regulate or tax organizations. True liberalism, on the other hand, accepts governments are necessary to protect the rights of individuals within a democratic framework than a liberal framework. Hence, nationalism, communism, and authoritarianism are also current antithetical challenges to liberalism. All of this is to say that liberalism is currently in peril, which means humanity is in peril because we cannot live in peace together, overcome our greatest challenges together, or make progress together without the only tools that have ever enabled us to do so, recognizing human dignity resulting in societies that are necessarily based on freedom, reason, and tolerance. That's how we survive and thrive together. Today, those on both the extreme right and left prefer to silence and demonize those they disagree with, uplift subjective experience and alternative facts as truth, and are as uncivil toward as they are intolerant of others. This is why liberalism must survive and come to thrive again, because it is the only mindset proven to unite our society and our species in order for us to make the next giant leap forward, so that perhaps some wise person in the future can look back and say of our time, it was this movement of liberalism, which marks the 21st century, as the most remarkable period of human history. Whether we call ideologies antithetical to liberalism philosophy or not, liberalism is the only ideology that has proven to advance human welfare and individual worth, always trudging against similar currents of resistance that deny reason and physics and objective truths, but succeeds nonetheless. Despite renewed political, religious, and social forces that renounce hard reality and scientific facts and that prevent progress, liberalism has proven to have staying power, and its principles continually recur to bring tangible hope and meaningful improvements to our existence. Today, liberalism is ridiculed, demeaned, mischaracterized by those on both the left and the right of things, and has become misunderstood by most as a result of all this negative publicity. Even many of us who are profoundly liberal in our spirits cannot articulate what it means and are reluctant to use the word to describe ourselves and our values. But its definition and values are easy to articulate and to recall. Liberalism is a belief in human dignity that results in greater freedom, reason, and tolerance. Liberalism is a belief in human dignity that results in greater freedom, reason, and tolerance. If this simple sentence describes you in what you most value, then you are a liberal. And I hope you are, because our confused and divided world needs liberals and needs to become liberal now more than ever. Thank you.
There I am. Thank you, Todd. Now we have some time for questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question, you'll see on the lower right-hand side of your screen a button that says reactions. If you click on that, the lowest part of that panel says raise hand. If you'll click that, you will advance to the upper left-hand side of the screen where I can see your hand and I'll call on you. Whoever would like to go first. Elisa, you're at the head of the list.
Thank you so much. That was very good for my head. The forces of anti-enlightenment thinking? What is the source from which they arise? Is it in our best interest to deal with them in different ways? And what might those ways be? I realize that's a full course, but any response to that would be very interesting.
Yeah, it is a very complicated topic, but I would say fundamentally the reason we resist Enlightenment thinking is fear, right? So human beings have a natural propensity of fear. In fact, if you look at our physiology, this upright, looking posture, this is the posture of caution and fear, right? Even most other bipeds walk around with their heads down. They sort of use their ability to stand to look out ahead of themselves, right? What's in the future? Are there any dangers there? I don't see any. I'll get back down and I'll creep forward and I'll get back up and I'll look again. And so this is what fear looks like. And human beings are always upright. We're very unstable creatures. We're slow. We don't have many physical defensives. We have to augment our lives to protect ourselves, and have done quite well with that thanks to our large brains. But basically, we're a very vulnerable species, and we have these nuggets in our head, the amygdala, that are a special place for fear. That's what their job is, to keep us alert, hyper alert, attent on the future. So there's this instinctive fear of uncertainty, of the unknown, and of the future. And so because we're afraid, we tend to try to recoil into what we think we know is true of the future. And anybody who threatens that actually would tell us we're living in an insecure situation, that our ideas about the world might not be true, and therefore we are insecure. So rather than to face that fear, we would rather live the lie.
But don't people like the Stoics deal with that aspect of human biology by how they discuss how to live a life well?
Yeah, absolutely. The Stoics.
And that's why it's hard for me to think that they're not philosophers as well. But anyway.
Well, I mean, would you go to a therapist and benefit from your therapist and say, well, oh, my therapist therefore is a philosopher, right? So Stoicism certainly has value. I practice Stoicism myself. I think it's brilliant, but it's a practice to me of how to live life, and how to overcome things like fear and some of the things that hold us back as human beings. So I see it more as a psychological benefit than I do of a philosophical benefit. So that's why I would make that distinction. My real point in making the distinction is just to say that there is this tendency for us to want to go inward and focus on ourselves. And that is the common reaction against any sort of mindset or approach that is generally looking outward and trying to face what's in front of us, what's really in front of us. So as I said, Socrates, Stoics, Epicureanism, maybe there's even some value in Plato. Those all have certain benefits to them. I would not count them as philosophy. I think it's something different, and those things emerged in reaction against it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Todd. There's a hand raised in the window that Vera and Richard occupy, and I don't know who has the question.
Unmute.
There we go.
Thank you, Todd. That was wonderful. I'd actually like to see your sermon written. I'd like to read it because you have a lot of facts in there. The question I've got has to do.
I'll send you guys the PDF.
Okay, great. The question I have, I would consider with your definition that I'm a liberal in my way of thinking. The word I have trouble with is tolerance. So how do you, in a way, tolerate when you're talking to someone who is, let's say, on the far right, is illiberal, is in some dogma, and how has these waves of liberalism overtaken illiberalism if they tolerate it? I'm not saying that very well, but it seems to me you've got to stand up in a way and say, I don't tolerate your belief. But speak to that a little bit, if you would. That's the word I'm having trouble with, is tolerance.
Well, again, I think it's just like the idea of philosophy coming to represent its almost opposite, right? This is what happens when people take over the language, right? They cause it to mean the opposite of what it meant. And so tolerance today seems to imply that we don't say things people disagree with, right? Whereas tolerance is really not allowing someone to say something that you disagree with, right? So that's the difference. It's not intolerant for you to disagree with somebody. You should, and you should be able to live in a society where that doesn't get you punished. Now to live in a society where, despite your differences, you're welcome and embraced and loved, that's an ideal, but tolerance is a very low bar. In fact, the idea of tolerance itself evolved over time. So initially, tolerance was considered the evil, because everyone was accustomed that we have to have one idea. We either follow the idea of the king or the high priest or the church doctrine. Otherwise, we would be at each other's throats. And people who promoted tolerance were considered crazy and evil, because they were trying to create a society that would be based on chaos. We cannot possibly get along with each other if we disagree. And all of that, sort of blew apart with the invention of the printing press, because now expression had become democratized to a greater degree than it ever had. There were a lot of ideas out there, and that led to brutal intolerance initially. They were killing people, they were persecuting each other, they were going to holy wars. And finally the Enlightenment, the Renaissance and Enlightenment said, we can't live like this. I mean, particularly Transylvania, where the Unitarians were. That was like this in-between country, in between the Sultan and in between the church, right? And so they were in this constant war, because they had everybody living in Transylvania. Muslims, Christians, Protestants, Catholics. It was part of the king's wisdom to say, "Oh, I like the religion where we don't have to agree. That's the one I like," right? Because in order to have a society where you weren't at war with each other, you had to create a society where you would create this low bar that says we won't kill you. But some of the first edicts of tolerance in the world basically meant that if we were a Catholic society and you were a Protestant, we won't kill you, but you can't worship in any of our public buildings. You have to practice your things at night. You can't marry people of the opposite religion. You can't bury your people in our cemeteries. There was all sorts of prejudice. The ghetto, where Germans or where Jews eventually put, was an act of tolerance. Right? We will let you live with us, but we will not kill you, but we're not going to treat you well. It's continued to evolve to where tolerance itself became the good and intolerance the evil. And then the idea of tolerance itself became a very mundane sort of bottom line thing we have to do so we don't kill each other. But I still like that definition of it, because in this sense, tolerance means, I don't have to like you. I don't have to agree with you. But you get the same rights and the same freedoms that I do. And I need to protect those for you, because that's what a tolerant society does. So remembering what tolerance really means, I think, answers your question, right? You get to disagree, and you should disagree with bad ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Todd. Next up is Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a big fan of the Enlightenment. And I've been pondering the idea of needing an Enlightenment 2.0 for the 21st century, kind of a new set of things to add to the original Enlightenment thought that we just didn't think of at the time. And I'll ask you for some, do you have any thoughts on this? I'll just throw out one example. That's the idea of greater and greater levels of cooperation over larger and larger scales should be a fundamental part of what drives us. But I'm interested in your thoughts too, if you have any on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We are in an age of what I call endarkenment. Endarkenment meaning that we are absolutely intolerant of anyone we disagree with, and so this is resulting in wars and emergence of totalitarian regimes, both home and abroad, and an incivility that exists in the Western Hemisphere in particular that I would like to say is unprecedented, but it's not. But it is certainly parallel to what happened after the printing press. So if you stop and think about it, what happened with the internet, and then the subsequent birth of social media, so whether it's YouTube or Twitter or I guess X now, Facebook, all this stuff, it's like the printing press on steroids. Okay, so now communication is completely democratized. You can go on YouTube and there's somebody sitting in front of their wall like I am, and they claim to be a reporter, and they're reporting on something, and usually it's with an extreme bias, right? So what has effectively happened, I liken it to the analogy of if you've ever gone into a crowded space, particularly one with poor acoustics, there's just a jumble of noise, a jumble of voices, and you cannot understand what anyone is saying. All that talking, and you can't understand it's confusing. So how do you sort that out? Well, you find one conversation, and you enter that conversation, and suddenly it makes sense. And you drown out all the other noise or ignore all the other sounds, the other voices, because you found a voice that makes sense. That's what we are doing to survive this chaos. And that's why we're moving into identitarianism and totalitarianism, these efforts to find one voice that makes sense to us in what is a chaotic reality rather than to face the chaotic reality. So yes, we are in a place where there is so much incivility that it's screwing everything up, right? Let's look at the government here in the US, again, example this week. We cannot move forward. We are spinning our wheels in the mud. We cannot advance as a society because we are so divided, we are so intolerant of each other that we cannot move forward. So the question is the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were born in bloodshed, right? Things got so bad that somebody said we have to do the opposite because what we're doing is not working. So the question is, when is that moment, Mike? When is that moment that it gets so bad that most of us say, no, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, solve the border crisis for God's sake, or whatever it is, right? We've got to tolerate each other, bare minimum, in order to work together to solve our problems together. When is that moment? When is that new Enlightenment moment, that Enlightenment 2.0 going to happen? I think it's gotten bad enough it needs to happen now. And this is why, this is the purpose of liberal religion. If we have a purpose in the world, this is why we're here. And I think that despite all the problems, the sadness, the grief that we've experienced with the loss of the UUA, the challenges it's facing, we nevertheless need to think beyond ourselves and recognize there is meaning in being a liberal and being part of a liberal religion, and there is a purpose in it. And our purpose is to promote this kind of civil society that will enable us to advance forward. So I'm all with you on the 2.0. It needs to happen sooner the better. The question is, how bad do things have to get before people agree with us?
Right. I love the 2.0 idea of something new, but I'm concerned that a large part of the population never really embraced the original Enlightenment yet either. So you have to promote that also.
Yeah.
Thank you, Todd. We have two more questions in queue, and then that's all the time we have. Either Joan or Martin has a question. Yes.
Yes, I think it's important that we define some of the terms that we're using. The term philosophy, and I'm guessing that it comes from phila for love and sophistry for arguing a position. Is that correct?
Sophia is wisdom. So it's love, the love of wisdom would be the etymology.
Very good. And then I'd like to thank Bernie Sanders for bringing back the terms liberal and progressive from the pejorative ash heap where they were thrown by Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah,
We'll be sure to tell him.
Well, very good points, but I would like to just go back to that because something happened. If for those of us who've been around a while will remember that it was during Ronald Reagan's years that he got rid of the fairness doctrine and passed basically changed the laws so that corporations could begin buying more mediums in one market than they were allowed. It used to be 3 mediums in one market. And then Clinton exacerbated that by opening those doors even wider. Prior to that, we didn't have a Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh was the first really to go on air and espouse a very extreme ideology without any counterbalance. And that led to Fox News, on cable. And then eventually MSNBC became the counter to Fox News. And we saw this increasing society in which people dressing up as broadcasters and having a news set were portraying themselves as giving us unbiased news when in fact they were giving us biased information. And then that only exploded with the advent of the internet and the ability of everybody to do that. But we have now gone, 2 or 3 generations here where there are people living in the world who have never seen a newscast by someone like Walter Cronkite, for example, that just gets up and says, here's what happened today. They didn't get up and say, hey, what's going to happen if? Let's talk to our experts. And they speculate about the future. Or they set up a scene. Here's what Donald Trump said today. But first, then they explain to you what you're going to hear. Then they show it, and then they come back and they reframe it again. So this is rampant intolerance, and Rush Limbaugh was only the beginning of moving towards biased perspectives. And now people think this is how we communicate. This is what has been modeled for us. We communicate by hating people who disagree with us.
Thank you, Todd. And our last live question from Greg.
Yeah, it was a wonderful talk, Todd. And you mentioned that there were some people like John Dewey who were Enlightenment minded, are there other people you'd recommend to look at, nowadays who might be, a lot more lot more aligned with your view of liberalism? I mean, are there those that you recommend us looking at? Certainly, I'd love to look at the written text because you did talk about a lot of things. So very inspiring, and I'm just wondering if there's other people that would agree with what you're saying that we could look for.
I'll recommend the first one that comes to mind is a new book by a philosopher named Susan Neiman. And she wrote a book called Left is Not Woke.
Okay, great.
And that's a really good one. It's short and it gets right to the point. I think for me, most of my thinking on this has come from studying the Enlightenment, studying philosophy, which takes a lot of time. Richie Robinson's new book called The Enlightenment. It's about that thick, over 1,000 pages, and then another great book on philosophy is A.C. Grayling's more recent History of Philosophy. What I love about that book is he doesn't talk about what I talked about today, but the narrative flows so that I catch the connection in the historical changes more than I ever have reading other histories of philosophy.
Hmm.
And that was the one that I sort of had this aha moment. Wow, it's like people are resisting, there's this idea, and then someone comes up and says, no, that's not true. It's the opposite. And then they take over and they call themselves philosophers. And an example would be, for these folks who have captured the institution of the UUA are saying they are the Unitarians. And I am not, that we are not. I was like, no, we are the Unitarians. You have captured this and you have rejected everything we stand for. It's the same sort of process, right? Where people are countering and then claiming the name for themselves. And I do have problems with some of those philosophies. Certainly not Stoicism. Would be a type of approach to life that I practice myself. But the idealism and romanticism, these these literally are, some of these people, Hegel and Kant and Schleiermacher, some of them are called counter-enlightenment philosophers. By the way, there's a great book called Understanding Postmodernism. What's the name? I'm forgetting the author's name right now. He's a philosopher in Canada. Anyway, Understanding Postmodernism is another good one. And it's also concise and gets to the point.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Todd, we have a couple quick questions in the chat. One is, do you have a recommended book by A.C. Grayling that takes on romanticism?
Yeah, again, I'd recommend his book, A History of Philosophy. He doesn't, he takes on philosophy in general and has a section in there on romanticism. I'm trying to think. There's probably a better book on romanticism, but I can't think of what it might be right now. I'm sorry.
It's all right. And finally, a quick question about the piece of artwork behind you.
Yeah. Well, it's a long story, but I'll be short. In Washington is one of those states where there is a Death with Dignity Act, and which means people who are at the end of their life can take a cocktail and end it in their own time. But the way it's practiced in Washington State is you can't do it. You can't do it in a hospital. You can't do it at hospice. You have to do it in your own home. Spokane is a huge medical hub, for people all over several states because we're the closest closest city to them. So they come from miles around. In some cases, they're terminal and they don't have any place they can go to take this cocktail. So we've had a couple of people want to use our home to do so. And this wall used to be blank. It needed a space. This is sort of in front of our dining area. And a woman named Bridget came with her family to die here. And I was talking with a couple of them about this space, and I said, we just don't know what's going to go there. Something's going to go there, but we're not sure what it is. And I came into my office a few weeks after she had died, and this was just sitting there with a note saying, Bridget would want you to have this for your wall. So
a beautiful story.
A reminder of Bridget's life. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your wonderful mind, Todd. We've made lots of impressions, I can tell. I'm sure there will be further conversations about what you've had to say, and I will appreciate too seeing the PDF when you have time.
Sure, I will email that to you. I thank you all for having me. It's really an honor, and I look forward to next time.
Thank you, Todd. And for the rest of you, Todd, thank you again so much. And we will have some later time with joys and concerns. But if you need to go, we'll wish you off with our love ritual. And those of you who want to stick around, that would be great too. So we'll send you off with loving kindness and look forward to seeing everyone the next time. Thanks again, Todd. Everybody, love ya. Sending you off with love and kindness. We need you.